All right, we're continuing on. This is part 2 of the notes. These are going to be more about the characteristics and the body systems of amphibians. So you can find amphibians on pretty much any continent except Antarctica. There's not very many amphibians on oceanic islands, and that's because they're very remote. And there's no way that they could have gotten there. So that means they evolved after Pangea separated. There are about 6,000 living species, which is not a lot compared to what once did exist millions of years ago. So here is kind of a breakdown of the double life of amphibians. They can live on land because they have bones that support their body, and they can use gas exchange with the air. And then in water, their bodies are supported by the buoyancy of their bodies, and their skin also allows for gas exchange with the water. Some external structures that are important for their survival. They have mucus covering their skin, and that will help protect them from the sun, protects them from any pathogens, little microorganisms, desiccation, which is drying out, and from injury. The moistness of their skin allows for gas exchange, so they can essentially breathe through their skin. It helps with temperature regulation and the absorption and storage of water. The amphibian's skin helps to keep them moist. It helps them when in mating. It can produce toxins. Some have the ability to change color. Sometimes there's bumps on there. There's claws, warts that have, like, sometimes they have like a sandpaper texture, and they'll have like a keratin buildup that makes them feel bumpy. And they don't have any scales. They don't have feathers, they don't have hair. So they have glands that can do all of these different types of things for them. Water is going to be very supportive for aquatic species, and it helps to keep them buoyant. Terrestrial species will have a skeleton for strong muscle attachment and supporting them against gravity. There are modifications in amphibians where they have a smaller, flatter skull, which makes it lighter than a fish's skull, and that way they can hold it up while they're on land. They also have jaws that allow for crushing and not necessarily chewing, but definitely crushing their prey. And then they have a flexible vertebral column that supports and suspends their weight between the limbs, kind of like a suspension bridge. So frogs have other adaptations in their skeletal system. They have these extension or protrusions coming off of their vertebrae, Zygapophyses. These are going to help them prevent twisting of their spinal cord. And then they have cervical vertebrae that allow them to nod and move their head now. They have sacral vertebrae that helps to attach the pelvic girdle to the vertebral column for extra support, and you can see it's kind of in a grayish color there. And then the picture shows a urostyle. This is the fused caudal vertebrae. Some organisms don't have all of their vertebrae fused at the end. And then they also have a sternum, which allows for more support in their rib cage area. It also provides a place for their forelimbs to be attached. And it happens in anurans, which are the frogs and toads. They don't have this sternum, but there are other classes of, or other groupings of these amphibians that do have a sternum. So the appendages that early amphibians had are more developed in our modern day amphibians, but they originated from lobe-finned fish. And they have more flexibility, they have more freedom of movement. There's a pelvic girdle that's very important as far as supporting the body on land. And here's just a couple diagrams showing how different amphibians move. We've got salamanders that have kind of like a wave motion or a wiggle motion. And then there's caecilians. These look like worms, but they are amphibians, and they kind of have an accordion-like movement, almost like earthworms do. Anurans have rear legs that are modified for jumping. They have much longer bones there and large muscles. Okay, moving on to nutrition and digestion. I'm pretty sure you have the diagram that you see here in your note packet, so you'll want to label that diagram. We will be dissecting a frog, so it's important that you know where its internal organs are and what they're called. Most of these adults amphibians are going to be carnivorous, and they eat little invertebrates. Bullfrogs, though, they can eat even small mammals. They can eat little mice and stuff. Bullfrogs have been known to catch birds out of the air, and sometimes they'll eat other frogs too. So bullfrogs are quite the predators. Most of these amphibians will hunt by sight, and they basically just sit and wait for prey to pass by them, and then they grab them. Salamanders and caecilians will use olfactory or their sense of smell to help catch prey. And all of the larvae of the amphibians, which are primarily like tadpole type, they're going to be herbivores. So they eat plant materials. And this is actually beneficial because that way the larval stage and the adult stage don't have to compete for the same food source, and they can live in close proximity and not have any competition. Most salamanders will have unspecialized jaws, meaning it's just a very general jaw. Anurans and some salamanders will use their tongue in a flip and grab mechanism. These are the first animal with a true tongue. The fish really only have like a little fleshy fold in their mouth. Mucus will help catch the prey. They do have like mucus lining their mouth. What they do is they press the prey against the roof of their mouth, and then muscles will help kind of slide it back to the esophagus. And then when they swallow, the eyes actually sink down. And I've actually got a video clip so that you can see what happens with their eyes. They suck down. It's kind of very interesting looking. As far as circulation goes, they have a two-loop circulatory system because they have lungs. If they're submerged in water, the blood vessels in the lungs will constrict, and the gases in the water can diffuse across their skin. So as I said earlier, they can breathe through their skin. This is how they do it. It's through diffusion, but it's a neat adaptation that they have so that they can sit down in the mud in a pond, like the pond that I have near my house, freezes over the top. But a lot of the frogs, and other amphibians will burrow into the mud, and they can survive the winter because they can essentially breathe through their skin. They don't have to breathe through their mouth. This slide is going to be important because it lists the different ways that amphibians can exchange gases. They have 3 ways that they can do it. So you may want to make a special note in the outline when you're writing this stuff down that there are 3 ways that they can exchange gases. I will be asking you that on a quiz or a test, so it's important that you remember these 3 ways. It's easier for organisms to exchange gas on land because there's more oxygen in the air than there is in water. However, it requires a moist surface to be able to have gas exchange on land. And when there's moisture, there's evaporation. So these animals are at risk of drying out. So luckily they do have mucous membranes that produce a special mucus that keeps them moist longer, but it's always a risk. So here the next 3 bullets are going to be the different ways that they can exchange gas. Cutaneous respiration, that means gas exchange across the skin. They do this through diffusion. They can do it in water or on land. This is a lot of the gas exchange that occurs for them. Then they have bucopharyngeal respiration, and this is where they can exchange gases just in their mouth and their pharynx. And they can do this for about 1 to 7% of the gas exchange that occurs. And then they have a buccal pump that helps force air into their lungs. It's considered a positive pressure breathing system. What we have, because we have a diaphragm, ours is negative pressure. But for them, they have to force air into their lungs to be able to exchange gases. So the three ways, again, are going to be through their skin, in their mouth, and in their lungs. That's where they can exchange gases. There are a few that are able to exchange gases through the lining, like in their cloaca, which is at the back end of them. But these are the three major ways that you should remember. Okay, temperature regulation. These guys are ectothermic, or better known as cold-blooded. So they need external heat to maintain a body temperature. When they're in the water, they take on the temperature of the water. When they're on land, depending on where they are, they take on that temperature of the surrounding area. Just like reptiles, they regulate their temperature through behavior. They can get out of the sun if they're too hot, or move into the sun if they're too cold. So they'll have a wide temperature range that their bodies can function at, and that's why you find amphibians on pretty much every continent in the world, except for Antarctica. All right, nervous system stuff. They have a very similar nervous system like other vertebrates. They have a much more complex brain than fish. They do have a forebrain, a midbrain, and a hindbrain that do different things. The forebrain, or the part in the front, it has the smell center. It has deals with color regulation, visceral functions, meaning body organs. Midbrain has the optic center, like so they can see, and it helps process visual information. And then their hindbrain is going to be for motor coordination, heart rate, respiration rate, things like that, the automatic stuff. They have a lot of different sense receptors, especially in their skin, to tell them about heat, cold, and pain. They do have a lateral line, but it's not going to be as sensitive as it is in fish because they don't live in the water as much. They can't really rely on that. They do have chemoreceptors in their nose and in their mouth so that they can smell and taste. They also use it for mate recognition, and they can detect noxious chemicals or bad tasting things. So amphibian eyes are definitely important in amphibians because they are sight hunters or sight feeders. So they wait for motion, and then they react to the motion to try and eat their food. Binocular vision is where you have two eyes, obviously, that are more forward facing, and it helps with depth perception. And that's going to be important too for a lot of these guys who are these sight hunters. Their eyelid on the bottom is movable, and it's called a nictitating membrane, and you can see it in a cat and in a dog. It kind of comes up and protects the eye, helps lubricate it, covers the cornea. They do have glands that help produce tears, essentially. Their structure of their eye, they have a lens, they have an iris, they do have rods and cones, meaning they can see dark and light, and they can see color, which is really important to know that they have that distinction, and it's very similar to ours. As far as hearing systems, frogs are adapted for life on land, so they have an eardrum. This tympanic membrane, which is the eardrum, is actually right on the side of their head, and we'll be able to see where their ears are located, but they do have a middle ear that has little bones in there, similar to ours. And then they have an inner ear too that helps transmit the sound waves to the nervous system so that they can hear. They also have semicircular canals in their inner ear that helps them with balance, similar to our inner ear structure. The muscles in anurans allow either the middle ear or the operculum to be locked and therefore filter out high or low frequency sounds. And then they do have different sounds that are important for different reasons. They can emit high frequency sounds for mating and low frequency sounds for warning of predators. Salamanders that live in streams have no mating calls, and they actually don't have a tympanic membrane or middle ear. They feel the low frequency sounds instead through whatever it is that they're sitting on. As far as excretion goes, or getting rid of metabolic waste, they do have kidneys. They're found in the dorsal wall of their body cavity, so towards their back. They excrete ammonia if they live in fresh water. There are some like aquatic frogs that live in water most of the time, so they can excrete ammonia. Or if they live on land, they're more likely to excrete urea. Osmoregulation, which is water regulation, is the biggest problem for amphibians. And it's because, especially the ones that live in the water, because they have to make sure they don't take on too much water or lose too much water. And then the ones that live on land have to have a way to conserve water so they don't dry out. Water conservation is important for all these amphibians because of the way their skin is structured, and they basically have to make sure they choose the right environment to maintain that moisture. In the bottom picture you can see the caecilians. They can curl up in a group, sometimes alone, but that'll help conserve water. There are some others that produce a protective covering, almost like a cocoon or a skin shell, where they can keep moisture locked in that way. And you can see in the bottom picture is kind of what was left behind after he shed this protective cocoon skin. This is the last slide in part 2 of the notes, so you can take another break or you can continue on to part 3.